Daniel had been dreaming about this moment for years. After spending over 2 decades working long nights and dealing with the worst society had to offer, he finally had his own place. A nice little townhome in Meadowbrook, a quiet community with tree-lined streets and families who actually waved at each other. It was everything he wanted after 22 years as a detective. The day he moved in, his neighbors seemed friendly enough. The older couple to his left brought over cookies. The family on the right helped him carry boxes. Everyone smiled and welcomed him to the neighborhood. For the first 3 days, Daniel thought he'd found paradise. He could finally relax, be close to his parents who were getting older, and maybe even take up some hobbies he'd been putting off for years. Then he met Carol. It was a Tuesday morning. Daniel had just finished his first cup of coffee and was heading out to his car when he saw her marching across the street. She was a woman in her late 50s, hair pulled back so tight it looked painful, carrying a clipboard like it was a weapon. Her eyes scanned his property the way he used to scan crime scenes, looking for anything out of place. "Excuse me," she called out before she even reached his driveway. "You're the new resident in Unit 47. Daniel smiled and extended his hand. "That's right. Just moved in this weekend. I'm Daniel." She didn't shake his hand. Instead, she flipped through the papers on her clipboard. "I'm Carol Hendricks, HOA President and Community Standards Coordinator. I need to discuss several violations I've observed." The smile on Daniel's face froze. Violations? He'd been here for 3 days. Carol pulled out a pen and started pointing. "Your grass is currently at 2 3/4 inches. HOA regulations state grass must be maintained at 2 1/4 inches maximum." "That's a violation." She made a mark on her paper. "Your mailbox is black, but it's not the approved shade of black. You'll need to repaint it with the specific color from our approved vendor list." Daniel looked at his mailbox. It was black. Just regular black. "I'm sorry, I didn't realize there were specific shades of..." Section 12, paragraph 4 of the HOA guidelines, Carol interrupted, not even looking up from her clipboard. "Furthermore, your welcome mat has a decorative border that exceeds the approved dimensions by approximately 2 inches. It needs to be replaced." For a moment, Daniel just stood there. In his career, he'd negotiated with armed suspects, talked down people in crisis, and dealt with some of the most difficult personalities imaginable. But this was something entirely different. This was someone who genuinely believed that his welcome mat was a serious community issue. "Okay," he said slowly, keeping his voice calm. "I wasn't aware of these specific rules. Where can I get a copy of the full guidelines?" Carol's expression suggested she'd been waiting for this question. "They were included in your closing documents. It's your responsibility as a homeowner to familiarize yourself with all community standards before taking up residence. Ignorance of the rules is not an excuse for non-compliance." She handed him a violation notice already filled out with his address and the 3 infractions she'd listed. At the bottom, there was a warning about potential fines if the issues weren't corrected within 7 days. "Have a productive day," Carol said, then turned and walked away, her shoes clicking on the pavement like tiny hammers. Daniel stood there holding the notice, wondering if he'd somehow moved into a bizarre alternate reality. He'd dealt with actual criminals who were more reasonable than this woman. That evening, he dug through his moving boxes until he found his closing documents. Buried in a thick folder was the HOA handbook. It was 73 pages long. As he flipped through it, his detective's eye started noticing patterns. The rules were incredibly specific, almost obsessively detailed. The exact shade of exterior paint colors. The precise height of grass measured not in approximate ranges but in 1/4-inch increments. The approved list of outdoor decorations, which seemed to exclude basically everything except a specific type of doormat and seasonal wreaths from pre-approved vendors. The next day, Daniel went to the hardware store and bought what he needed. He spent his Saturday morning trimming his grass with a ruler nearby, repainting his mailbox with the specific shade of black from Carol's approved vendor, and replacing his welcome mat with a plain one that met the exact dimensions in the handbook. He thought that would be the end of it. He was wrong. On Monday, another violation notice appeared on his door. This time, Carol claimed his car was parked 6 inches over the edge of his driveway. Daniel went outside and measured. His car was maybe 2 inches over, and that was only because his driveway had a slight slope. He took photos and made notes, old habits from years of documenting evidence. On Wednesday, there was a notice about his security camera. Carol claimed it was angled in a way that could potentially invade neighbors' privacy. Daniel checked the camera feed. It only showed his own front door and porch, nowhere else. He adjusted it anyway, angling it even more directly at just his door. On Friday, Carol appeared at his door again. This time she wanted to discuss the small American flag he'd mounted next to his garage. According to her, it wasn't on the approved decorations list and needed to be removed. That's when Daniel started to realize this wasn't about rules at all. This was about control. He started paying attention to the neighborhood in a different way. Over the next week, he noticed things. The elderly couple who'd brought him cookies had a small garden gnome that disappeared one day. When he asked about it, the wife quietly mentioned they'd been fined by the HOA. The family on his right kept their son's bicycle out of sight in their garage, even though the boy was only 7 and clearly wanted to ride it. They mentioned Carol had threatened violation notices if toys were left visible in the yard. One evening, Daniel was taking out his trash when he met his neighbor from across the street, a young single mother named Rita. She looked exhausted, carrying groceries while her daughter played nearby. "Need a hand?" Daniel offered. "That'd be great, thanks," she said gratefully. As they walked toward her door, she added quietly, "You're the new guy Carol's been targeting, right?" Daniel nodded. "That obvious?" Rita gave a tired laugh. "She does it to everyone at first. Tests them, sees who'll push back and who'll just comply. But some of us get it worse than others." She paused, then said carefully, "She gave me a violation notice for hanging my laundry outside. Said it was unsightly. But I'm trying to save money on electricity, you know? Single income, trying to raise my kid. But Carol doesn't care about that." That night, Daniel couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about what Rita had said. About the elderly couple losing their garden gnome. About the 7-year-old who couldn't leave his bike in his own yard. About Carol targeting people over things that didn't matter to anyone except her. He started keeping a file. Every interaction with Carol he documented. Every violation notice he photographed and dated. Every conversation with neighbors he made notes about. It was instinctive, the way he'd been trained to build cases for over 2 decades. Because something was telling him this wasn't just about an overzealous HOA president. There was a pattern here, and Daniel had spent his entire career finding patterns. He just didn't know yet how bad it was going to get. The violations kept coming like clockwork. Every few days, there was a new notice on Daniel's door. His trash bins were visible from the street for 20 minutes after pickup. His car was parked at a slight angle. A delivery box sat on his porch for 3 hours before he got home from work. Each one came with the same threatening tone about fines and potential legal action. Daniel dealt with it the way he dealt with everything in his professional life. He stayed calm, documented everything, and started looking deeper. Because after a month of this, he knew something wasn't right. Carol wasn't just enforcing rules. She was hunting for violations. One Saturday morning, Daniel was working in his garage when his elderly neighbor, George, walked over. The old man was probably in his 70s, moving slowly but with purpose. "Got a minute?" George asked, glancing around like he was worried someone might see him. "Of course. Everything okay?" George sighed and pulled out a piece of paper from his jacket pocket. "Another violation notice. My grandson visited last weekend. He's 4 years old. Left his little red wagon in the front yard while we had lunch. Carol hit us with a $200 fine for unauthorized storage of recreational equipment in violation of community aesthetic standards." Daniel felt his jaw tighten. "A 4-year-old's wagon?" "She took photos and everything," George said, his voice shaking slightly. "My wife and I were on a fixed income. We can't afford these random fines, but Carol doesn't care. She told me if we can't comply with community standards, maybe we should consider moving somewhere more suitable for our situation." "She actually said that?" "Word for word." George looked tired. "We've lived here for 15 years. Never had a problem until she became HOA president 2 years ago. Now we're afraid to have our grandson visit." After George left, Daniel stood in his garage thinking, a child's wagon. That's what Carol considered a serious violation. He added it to his growing file. The pattern became clearer over the next few weeks. Daniel started paying attention to who was getting violation notices and who wasn't. Carol seemed to have favorites in the neighborhood. The families with expensive cars and perfect lawns never got notices, but Rita, the single mom, had a stack of them. George and his wife had several. The young couple, who were both teachers struggling with student loans, got cited for things like their house numbers being slightly faded. Then there was Victor, a veteran who lived 3 houses down. Daniel had seen him a few times, usually working in his small garden. He kept to himself mostly. One evening, Daniel was walking past and noticed Victor taking down a small display from his window. It had been a shadow box with military medals and a folded flag. Heading inside for the night, Daniel asked, trying to sound casual. Victor looked embarrassed. Carol said it violated the window display policy. Too visible from the street, apparently. She gave me 48 hours to remove it or face fines. He held up the shadow box. 20 years in the service and I can't even display my medals in my own window. Daniel felt something shift inside him. This wasn't about maintaining property values or community standards. This was about power. Carol had found a way to control people, and she was using the HOA rules as her weapon. He started asking around more carefully, building conversations naturally with neighbors. The picture that emerged made his detective instincts scream. Carol had a type. She targeted elderly residents who were easier to intimidate. Single parents who didn't have time to fight back. Veterans and minorities. Anyone who seemed vulnerable or different from her idea of the perfect neighbor. Meanwhile, the Johnsons 2 streets over had been parking their boat in their driveway for months, clearly visible and definitely against HOA rules. No violation notice. The Mitchells had a dog that barked constantly at all hours. Nothing. But when Rita's daughter drew a hopscotch grid on their driveway with washable chalk, Carol was there within an hour with a notice about defacing common area property. Daniel started attending HOA meetings. They were held once a month in the community clubhouse, and usually only about 10 people showed up out of the 200 homes in Meadowbrook. Carol ran them like a dictator. She'd present violation reports, announce new policies, and shut down anyone who tried to question her decisions. At one meeting, a younger couple tried to ask why enforcement seemed inconsistent. Carol cut them off mid-sentence, citing procedural rules about how questions had to be submitted in writing 72 hours in advance. When they persisted, she threatened to have them removed for disrupting official HOA business. Daniel sat in the back and watched. He noticed that the other board members barely spoke. When they did, it was usually to agree with whatever Carol said. After the meeting, he approached one of them, an accountant named Pete, who seemed uncomfortable with the whole situation. "Interesting meeting," Daniel said casually. Pete looked around nervously. "Yeah, Carol runs a tight ship. Seems like she makes a lot of decisions unilaterally." "Look," Pete said quietly, "between you and me, most of us on the board are just trying to avoid becoming her next target. She's already pushed out 2 board members who disagreed with her, found violations at their properties, made their lives miserable until they resigned and moved away. I've got kids in the local school district. I can't afford to move right now, so I just keep my head down and vote however she wants." That conversation confirmed what Daniel already suspected. Carol had created a system where nobody felt safe challenging her. She ruled through fear and selective enforcement. Things got worse in the 3rd month. Daniel came home one day to find Carol on his property, actually measuring the distance between his house and his neighbor's fence line. She was on her hands and knees with a measuring tape taking notes. "Can I help you with something?" Daniel asked, keeping his tone neutral. Carol stood up, not at all embarrassed to be caught. "Your fence is 3 inches over the property line into the common area. That's a violation of the boundary ordinance. That fence was here when I bought the place. It's been there for at least 10 years. Previous violations don't excuse current ones," Carol said, making notes on her ever-present clipboard. "You have 14 days to move the fence or face daily fines of $50. Daniel looked at the fence. Moving it would cost thousands of dollars. The 3 inches she was talking about was barely noticeable. "I'd like to see the survey documents that show the exact property lines. Those are available at the county records office. It's not my job to provide them to you." Carol finished her notes and started walking away, then turned back. "Oh, and Daniel, I've noticed you've been asking a lot of questions around the neighborhood, stirring up trouble. I'd hate for your violations to become more frequent if you continue to disrupt community harmony." And there it was. An actual threat. Carol had just admitted, without realizing it, that she was willing to weaponize violations against people who questioned her. That night, Daniel spread out all his documentation on his dining room table. Violation notices, dates, photos, notes from conversations with neighbors. He organized everything chronologically and by resident. The pattern wasn't just clear anymore. It was undeniable. Carol was running a protection racket disguised as an HOA. Follow her rules, don't question her authority, and you'd be mostly left alone. Push back or fall into one of her target categories and she'd bury you in violations and fines. Daniel had spent over 2 decades building cases against people who abused power. He knew how to document evidence, how to establish patterns, how to build an airtight case, and he was doing it all again now, except this time it was personal. He just needed one more piece. He needed Carol to go too far, to cross a line that was undeniable and public, because taking down someone who'd built their own little kingdom required more than just documentation. It required catching them in the act of showing everyone exactly who they really were. Daniel didn't have to wait long. Carol was getting bolder, more confident in her power. And confident people made mistakes. He just had to be patient and ready when she finally made hers. Daniel had requested a week off work. His father had just had knee surgery, and at 73 he needed someone around to help him get to appointments and handle things around the house. Daniel was grateful he could be there. After all those years of missing family events because of work emergencies, he finally had the chance to be the son his parents deserved. It was a Saturday afternoon, warm and sunny. The kind of day that made Daniel remember why he'd wanted to live in a place like Meadowbrook in the first place. His father was resting inside, comfortable and recovering well. Daniel decided to spend a few hours in his driveway working on something he'd been putting off for years. His personal project car sat there, a classic from the 80s that he'd bought years ago with dreams of restoring it. Life had gotten in the way, as it always did, but now he finally had time. He pulled out his tools, put on some classic rock at a reasonable volume, and got to work. It felt good to do something with his hands, something that didn't involve paperwork or stress. He was under the hood, checking the carburetor, when he heard footsteps, fast, angry footsteps. He didn't even need to look up to know who it was. "What exactly do you think you're doing?" Carol's voice was sharp enough to cut glass. Daniel straightened up, wiping his hands on a rag. "Working on my car." Beautiful day for it. Carol's face was already red. Her clipboard clutched against her chest like a shield. "This is absolutely unacceptable. You're in violation of at least 4 different community ordinances." "Really?" Daniel kept his voice calm. "Which ones?" "Noise pollution for one," she said, gesturing at his radio. "Commercial vehicle maintenance is prohibited in residential driveways. You're creating an eyesore visible from the street, and you're clearly operating an unauthorized automotive repair business." Daniel blinked. "Carol, this is my personal car. I'm working on it in my own driveway on a Saturday afternoon. The music is barely above conversation level. And I'm definitely not running a business." "That's not for you to determine," Carol shot back. "I've documented everything. The noise, the commercial activity, the blight on our community's appearance. This ends now." A few neighbors had started coming out, drawn by Carol's raised voice. Daniel noticed Rita across the street, watching nervously. George was standing on his porch. Even the Thompsons from next door had come out to see what the commotion was about. "Carol?" Daniel said slowly. "I'm just working on my own car, during permitted hours, on my own property. I'm not breaking any reasonable rules." "Reasonable?" Carol's voice went up an octave. "You don't get to decide what's reasonable. I'm the HOA president. I enforce the rules. And you've been nothing but a problem since you moved here, questioning my authority, talking to other residents, trying to undermine the community standards I've worked so hard to maintain." Daniel noticed her hands were shaking. She was angrier than he'd ever seen her, and he'd seen her pretty angry before. Something about him just existing in this neighborhood seemed to personally offend her. "I'm not trying to undermine anything," Daniel said. "I'm just living my life." "Your life?" Carol laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You come into this neighborhood. You ignore the rules. You encourage others to disrespect my authority. People like you don't belong in a community like Meadowbrook. You're lowering property values. You're disrupting the peace. You're setting a bad example." The way she said "people like you" made Daniel's jaw tighten. He'd heard that phrase before in his line of work. It was never about rules. It was always about something else. More neighbors were gathering now. Daniel could see them watching, some looking uncomfortable, others nodding like they'd been waiting for someone to finally stand up to Carol's nonsense. "I think you should leave my property now," Daniel said quietly. "I will not." Carol's voice was getting louder. Not until you pack up this disaster and promise to cease all unauthorized activities. And you need to understand something. I have the power to make your life very difficult here. I can fine you into the ground. I can make sure you regret ever moving to Meadowbrook. Are you threatening me? Daniel asked, making sure his voice carried to the neighbors who were watching. I'm promising you, Carol said. Either you fall in line or I'll make sure you leave. One way or another. Daniel crossed his arms and said nothing. He'd learned a long time ago that sometimes the best response was silence. Let the other person keep talking, keep escalating, keep showing everyone exactly who they really were. And Carol did not disappoint. You think you're so special, don't you? She continued, her face getting redder. Coming in here with your attitude, your car projects, your complete disregard for how things work in this community. Well, I've dealt with people like you before. I know how to handle troublemakers. I'm working on my car, Daniel repeated calmly. That's all I'm doing. You're being threatening, Carol suddenly shouted. You're standing there with your tools, your aggressive posture, your refusal to comply. I feel threatened. Everyone here should feel threatened. Daniel actually laughed at that. He couldn't help it. He was standing in his own driveway holding a rag, his tools neatly organized on a workbench. The idea that he was threatening anyone was absurd, but that laugh was apparently the last straw for Carol. She pulled out her phone, her hands trembling with rage. Fine. If you won't listen to me, maybe you'll listen to the police. Daniel's expression didn't change, but inside, something clicked into place. This was it. This was the moment Carol was going too far in front of witnesses in broad daylight, with half the neighborhood watching. You're calling the police? He asked calmly. Because I'm working on my car in my driveway? I'm calling the police, Carol said, her finger already dialing. Because there's a suspicious, possibly dangerous individual refusing to comply with community regulations and acting in a threatening manner. Someone needs to come here and deal with the situation properly. Daniel heard her speaking to the 911 dispatcher. She was putting on a performance, her voice suddenly scared and shaky. Yes, there's a man in our neighborhood being very aggressive and threatening. He's refusing to follow rules and I'm afraid of what he might do. Please send someone quickly. She hung up and looked at Daniel with triumph in her eyes. There. The police are on their way. Maybe they can explain to you how community standards work. Maybe you'll show them more respect than you've shown me. Daniel just smiled. It wasn't a mean smile or a mocking one. It was the smile of someone who knew exactly what was about to happen and was completely at peace with it. Okay, he said simply. Let's wait for the police then. Carol seemed thrown off by his calm reaction. You should be worried, she said. Filing false complaints, creating disturbances, threatening HOA officials. They could arrest you, could they? Daniel asked, still smiling slightly. They absolutely could, Carol said, her confidence returning. I've documented everything. Every violation, every instance of your defiance. The police will see the pattern. They'll understand what kind of person you are. Daniel leaned against his car and crossed his arms, completely relaxed. Around them, neighbors were watching with a mixture of concern and curiosity. Rita looked worried, probably thinking about all the times Carol had used authority against people who couldn't fight back. George was recording on his phone, Daniel noticed. Smart man. In the distance, Daniel could hear sirens, getting closer. His smile widened just a little bit. Carol heard them too. She straightened up, smoothed her hair, and clutched her clipboard. Remember, she said to Daniel, you brought this on yourself. All you had to do was follow the rules and respect authority. Respect authority, Daniel repeated softly. Right. The sirens were very close now. 2 patrol cars turned onto their street, lights flashing. Carol positioned herself between Daniel and the approaching vehicles, like she was protecting the neighborhood from a dangerous criminal. Daniel didn't move. He just stood there waiting, that slight smile still on his face. Because in about 30 seconds, Carol's entire world was about to come crashing down, and he was going to enjoy every moment of it. The patrol cars pulled up to the curb, and 2 officers stepped out. Daniel recognized them immediately. Officer Bradley had worked a case with him about 6 months ago, and Officer Chen was one of the newer recruits who'd just completed training at the academy, where Daniel had given several lectures on investigation procedures. Their eyes landed on Daniel first, and he saw the exact moment recognition hit them. Bradley's eyebrows shot up. Chen actually stopped mid-step, her mouth opening slightly in confusion. Chief Thompson? Bradley said, looking between Daniel and Carol with complete bewilderment. Sir, we got a call about a disturbance? The word chief seemed to echo in the sudden silence. Carol's head whipped around to look at Daniel, her face going from red to pale in about 2 seconds. Chief? She repeated, her voice suddenly small. As in, police chief? Daniel gave her a calm look. Detective chief, actually. Third in command of the Metropolitan Police Department. 22 years on the force. He turned to the officers. Hey, Bradley Chen. Sorry to pull you away from patrol for this. Carol was stammering now, her clipboard trembling in her hands. You're a police officer? Detective chief, Officer Bradley corrected, and there was a hint of protectiveness in his voice that made Daniel appreciate his team even more. One of the highest-ranking investigators in the entire department. Officer Chen was looking at Carol now with an expression Daniel had seen on many officers' faces before. The look they got when they realized they'd been called out on a bogus complaint. Ma'am, you reported a dangerous individual acting threatening. Can you explain the situation? Carol opened her mouth, closed it, then tried again. He was violating community rules and refused to comply, and I thought I was working on my car, Daniel said simply, gesturing to his vehicle and the neatly organized tools. In my driveway. On a Saturday afternoon, during permitted hours. Ms. Hendricks here disagreed with that. Bradley looked at the scene. A classic car, some tools, a radio playing quietly. He looked back at Carol with barely concealed disbelief. You called 911 for this? She said I was being threatening and dangerous, Daniel added, in front of about 15 witnesses. He gestured to the neighbors who were still watching, many of them now recording on their phones. Officer Chen pulled out her notepad. Ma'am, filing a false police report is a criminal offense. Did you have any actual reason to believe you or anyone else was in danger? Carol was trying to backtrack now, her words tumbling over each other. I was just trying to enforce HOA regulations. He was being defiant, and I have the authority as HOA president to call 911 and claim someone is dangerous when they're clearly not. Bradley's voice was firm now. That's a misuse of emergency services. You do understand that while we're here dealing with this, we could be responding to actual emergencies? Daniel reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. Officers, while you're here, there's something else you should probably know about. He pulled up his documentation folder. I've been keeping records of Ms. Hendricks's activities over the past few months. I think you'll find some patterns that might interest you. Carol's eyes went wide. You've been investigating me? Documenting, Daniel corrected. Public interactions, violation notices, conversations with neighbors, all perfectly legal. He handed his phone to Officer Chen. You'll notice a pattern of selective enforcement. Certain residents get cited for minor or sometimes non-existent violations, while others with actual violations are ignored. Chen scrolled through the phone, her expression growing more serious. This is pretty detailed. Old habits, Daniel said with a slight shrug. Once a detective, always a detective. Rita stepped forward from where she'd been watching. Officers, if you want to talk to us, most of the neighborhood has stories. Carol's been targeting specific people. Elderly residents, single parents, veterans. Anyone she decides doesn't fit her vision of the perfect community. George walked over too, his phone still recording. I'm 74 years old. She fined me $200 because my 4-year-old grandson left a wagon in my yard for 2 hours. Victor, the veteran, joined them. She made me take down my military medals from my window. Said they violated display policies. More neighbors started coming forward, each with their own story. Officer Bradley was taking notes, and Daniel could see his jaw getting tighter with each account. Chen had moved on to taking statements from other residents. Carol was backing away slowly, her face ashen. You're all ganging up on me. I was just doing my job. Someone has to maintain standards in this community. By targeting specific people? Daniel asked quietly. By threatening residents who question you? By using your position to intimidate and harass? He looked at the officers. I've documented at least 30 instances of selective enforcement over 3 months. The pattern is undeniable. Officer Bradley looked at Carol seriously. Ma'am, I need to inform you that filing a false police report is a misdemeanor. Additionally, we're going to need to forward this information about discriminatory practices to our Community Liaison Division. They handle civil rights complaints. Civil rights? Carol's voice was a whisper now. I was just enforcing rules. Selectively, Officer Chen added, looking up from her notes. Based on what I'm hearing from these residents, you've been targeting protected classes. Elderly individuals, minorities, single parents. That's not just an HOA issue. That's potentially a legal issue. Daniel pulled out a folder from his car where he'd kept hard copies of everything. I have violation notices, photos, recordings of interactions, witness statements, all organized chronologically and by resident. I was going to present it to the HOA board and potentially pursue a civil complaint, but since we're all here now. He handed the folder to Bradley, who flipped through it with growing disbelief. This is a pretty airtight case of harassment. And there's one more thing, Daniel said, pulling out another document. I did some research into the HOA finances. Public records, all legal. Carol's been collecting fines and processing them through the HOA account, but the amounts don't quite match up with what's being reported to the board. There's about $15,000 unaccounted for over the past 18 months. Carol made it sound like she'd been punched. You can't. Those records are private. They're not, actually, Daniel said. HOA financial records are accessible to all homeowners. It's in the bylaws you're so fond of citing. Section 27, paragraph 3. Officer Bradley closed the folder and looked at Carol with an expression that was all business. Ms. Hendricks, at this point I'm going to issue you a citation for filing a false police report. I'm also going to recommend that you seek legal counsel, because based on what I'm seeing here, you may be facing additional complaints, both civil and potentially criminal. Carol tried one more time. I'm the HOA president. I was maintaining community standards. That's my job. Your job, Officer Chen said firmly, is not to harass residents, file false police reports, or potentially embezzle HOA funds. Your job is definitely not to waste emergency services time because someone won't follow your personal vendettas. Rita spoke up again. Officers, a lot of us have been afraid to speak up before. Carol would retaliate with more fines, more violations. She pushed out anyone who disagreed with her, made their lives so miserable they had to leave. That's going to stop now, Bradley said. He turned to the gathered neighbors. Anyone who wants to file a formal complaint, you can come down to the station. We'll document everything properly. He looked at Daniel. And Chief, I think the community liaison team is going to want to talk to you about all this documentation you've put together. Daniel nodded. Happy to help. This is my home now. I'd like it to actually be the peaceful community it's supposed to be. Carol stood there, her clipboard hanging limply at her side, looking smaller somehow than she had just 30 minutes ago. All that authority she'd wielded like a weapon had evaporated the moment she'd realized she'd been targeting someone who actually knew how to build a case against someone abusing power. Can I go? She asked quietly. For now, Bradley said, but expect to hear from us, and from the HOA board, and probably from a lawyer or two. As the officers wrapped up their reports, neighbors came up to Daniel one by one, thanking him, apologizing for not standing up sooner, asking what happens next. Daniel assured them all that things would get better, that Carol's reign of terror was over, that they could finally live in their homes without fear of arbitrary fines and harassment. Carol walked back to her house without another word, and Daniel noticed she was no longer carrying her clipboard. It lay abandoned on his driveway, all those violation notices and threats literally scattered in the wind. Officer Bradley approached Daniel before leaving. Sir, I've got to say this might be the most satisfying call I've responded to all year. Daniel laughed. Glad I could make your day interesting. You moving to the neighborhood is probably the worst thing that ever happened to her, Chen added with a grin. I just wanted to work on my car, Daniel said, looking at his project vehicle. But yeah, I guess it didn't work out the way she expected. As the patrol cars drove away and neighbors slowly returned to their homes, Daniel finally got back to what he'd been doing before Carol's interruption. Working on his car, enjoying a Saturday afternoon, living peacefully in his own home, except now he could do it without looking over his shoulder for the next violation notice. The next few days were quiet, almost suspiciously so. Daniel half expected Carol to show up with another violation notice, some desperate attempt to reassert her authority. But she didn't. In fact, he didn't see her at all. Her car stayed in her driveway. Her curtains remained closed, and for the first time since he'd moved to Meadowbrook, Daniel's mailbox stayed blissfully free of HOA complaints. Other neighbors noticed too. Rita mentioned that she'd actually left her daughter's bike out front overnight, something she'd been too afraid to do for years. Nothing happened. No notice appeared on her door the next morning. George's grandson visited again that weekend, and his little wagon sat in the yard for hours while they played. Still nothing. It was like the entire neighborhood had been holding its breath for 2 years, and suddenly everyone could exhale. On Wednesday, Daniel got a call from Pete, the accountant on the HOA board. His voice was different than before, stronger, less nervous. "Daniel, we're calling an emergency board meeting tomorrow night. Can you come? We'd really appreciate it if you could bring that documentation you mentioned." "Of course," Daniel said. "What's happening?" Pete let out a long breath. Carol submitted her resignation this morning, effective immediately. Didn't give a reason. Just said she was stepping down due to personal matters. The rest of the board wants to review everything before we accept it. We need to know exactly what we're dealing with. The meeting was held at 7 in the evening at the community clubhouse. Daniel expected maybe a dozen people. Instead, he walked in to find the room packed. Every seat was taken, people were standing along the walls, and more residents were filtering in. He recognized faces he'd never even seen at neighborhood gatherings before. Pete was at the front table with the other 3 board members, all of them looking nervous but determined. When Daniel walked in, the room quieted down. He felt dozens of eyes on him as he made his way to the front. "Thank you all for coming," Pete began, his voice shaking slightly. "I think everyone knows why we're here. For those who don't know, this is Daniel Thompson. He's been documenting some concerning patterns in HOA enforcement over the past few months." "Daniel, would you mind sharing what you found?" Daniel stood up and pulled out his folder. He'd organized everything into a clear presentation, the same way he'd present evidence in an investigation. He went through it methodically. The selective enforcement patterns, the targeting of specific residents, the financial discrepancies, the intimidation tactics. Every claim was backed up with documentation, dates, photos, and witness accounts. The room was dead silent as he spoke. Some people were nodding, clearly recognizing their own experiences in what he described. Others looked shocked, maybe not realizing how systematic Carol's behavior had been. When he finished, one of the other board members, a woman named Linda, spoke up. "I need to apologize to everyone here. I've been on this board for 3 years and I let this happen." Carol was so forceful, so confident, that I convinced myself she must know what she was doing. I was wrong. We all were. "I was scared of her," admitted another board member, an older man named Frank. "She made it clear that anyone who disagreed with her would become her next target. I'm ashamed to say I chose protecting myself over doing what was right." Rita stood up from the audience. "A lot of us were scared. But what Daniel did, documenting everything and standing up to her, that gave the rest of us courage." "We don't blame you for being afraid. We were too." The discussion went on for over an hour. Neighbors shared their stories. Some people cried, talking about how Carol's harassment had made them feel unwelcome in their own homes. Victor, the veteran, talked about how demoralizing it felt to have his service disrespected. George mentioned that his wife had developed anxiety about having their family visit. Finally, Pete brought up the financial records. Based on what Daniel found and what our own accountant discovered when we actually looked closely at the books, there's approximately $15,000 unaccounted for over the past 18 months. Money that was collected in fines but never properly deposited into the HOA account. The room erupted in angry murmurs. That wasn't just abuse of power. That was theft. "Carol's resignation is not accepted," Pete said firmly. "Instead, the board is voting to remove her for cause. We're also filing a formal complaint with the police about the missing funds, and we'll be pursuing legal action to recover the money." There was applause at that. Actual applause in an HOA meeting. Daniel had to smile at the irony. "But that's not enough," Linda added. "We need to make sure this never happens again. We're proposing a complete overhaul of how this HOA operates, clear guidelines for enforcement, an appeals process for violations, regular financial audits, and most importantly, accountability for board members." Over the next hour, the board and residents worked together to outline new policies. Daniel contributed where he could, suggesting systems that would prevent any one person from having too much unchecked authority. They voted to refund all questionable fines from the past 2 years. They established a committee to review the HOA rules and remove ones that were overly restrictive, or served no real purpose. By the time the meeting ended at 10 o'clock, Meadowbrook had essentially reinvented itself. It was still an HOA, still had rules, but now those rules would be enforced fairly and reasonably. As people filed out, many stopped to thank Daniel personally. Some apologized for not standing up sooner. Others asked if he'd consider joining the HOA board, but he politely declined. He'd done enough detective work for one lifetime. He just wanted to work on his car in peace. The legal consequences for Carol came swiftly. The police investigation confirmed the financial discrepancies. She was charged with embezzlement and filing false reports. The HOA filed a civil lawsuit to recover the stolen funds. Within a month, Carol's house had a for sale sign in the yard. By the time summer arrived, she was gone, moved to another state according to the neighborhood gossip. Daniel never took any satisfaction in her downfall. He'd seen too many people ruin their own lives through bad choices to find joy in it, but he was relieved that she could no longer hurt the people in his community. Life in Meadowbrook changed in small but meaningful ways. George's grandson visited every weekend now, his toys scattered across the yard without fear. Rita hung her laundry outside on sunny days, saving money and teaching her daughter about being resourceful. Victor put his shadow box back in the window, and neighbors often stopped to thank him for his service. The neighborhood started having regular block parties. People who'd been too afraid to be noticed before came out of their shells. Kids played in the streets again. Neighbors helped each other with yard work and home repairs without worrying about violation notices. Daniel finally finished restoring his project car. It took him 6 months working on weekends and evenings. When he took it for its first real drive, half the neighborhood came out to see. They cheered as he drove down the street, the engine purring perfectly. One evening, Daniel was sitting on his porch when Pete walked over with a beer in each hand. He handed one to Daniel and sat down. "You know," Pete said, "I've been thinking about what happened. Carol had all this power, all this authority, and she used it to make people miserable. You had actual power, real authority as a detective chief, and you never once threw it around until you absolutely had to." Daniel took a sip of his beer. "Power doesn't mean much if you use it to hurt people. I learned that a long time ago. Well, on behalf of everyone here, thank you. You gave us our neighborhood back." After Pete left, Daniel sat there watching the sunset. His father was recovering well. His neighbors were happy. His car was restored. And for the first time in months, there wasn't a single violation notice anywhere in sight. He thought about Carol sometimes, wondering if she'd learned anything from what happened. Probably not. People like that rarely did. But that wasn't his problem anymore. Daniel had spent 22 years dealing with people who abused power in big ways. Criminals, corrupt officials, dangerous people who hurt others. He'd never expected to spend his retirement dealing with someone who abused power in small ways, through HOA rules and petty violations. But in the end, abuse of power was abuse of power, no matter the scale. The difference was that the big cases usually ended with arrests and trials and prison sentences. This one ended with a neighborhood healing, people feeling safe in their homes again, and an elderly couple able to have their grandson visit without fear. Daniel decided he preferred this ending. He finished his beer, went inside to check on his father, and started planning his next project. Maybe he'd build a small garden in his backyard. He'd have to check the HOA rules first, of course, but somehow he didn't think that would be a problem anymore.